A racist police officer punches a black man in the face and then arrests him for no reason. He is shocked to find out the black man is a billionaire. The sun was setting over the quiet side street, casting long shadows across the pavement. Elijah Foster, dressed in a tailored navy suit, walked briskly, his polished shoes tapping a steady rhythm on the concrete. He was on his way to a meeting, focused, with no idea that Officer Craig Walters had been watching him from across the street, studying every detail with a hardened expression. "Hey, you!" Walters' voice rang out, sharp and commanding. Elijah stopped, his eyes narrowing as he turned to see the officer approaching him with a calculated, almost hostile look. "Yes, officer. Can I help you with something?" Elijah asked, keeping his voice steady and his expression neutral. Walters looked him up and down, taking in the designer suit, the gleaming watch on Elijah's wrist, and the confident, almost regal way Elijah carried himself. There was something in the officer's expression that Elijah recognized, a look of suspicion mixed with resentment. "Where are you headed, sir?" Walters asked, the forced politeness in his tone barely masking the underlying edge. "I'm on my way to a business meeting," Elijah replied, maintaining eye contact. He could feel the officer sizing him up, searching for something to latch onto. "A business meeting?" Walters echoed, his voice laced with disbelief. "And what kind of business do you do?" "Exactly." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "I don't see how that's relevant. I'm simply walking down the street, officer." Walters took a step closer, his gaze hardening. "See, it's funny," he began, his voice thick with sarcasm. "A guy like you, dressed in a suit like that, doesn't seem to fit the area now, does it?" Elijah kept his voice calm, though he felt a flicker of annoyance. "Is there a law against wearing a suit here?" Walters smirked, his eyes cold. "No, but it does make a person wonder. Maybe you're just passing through, or maybe you're up to something else." Elijah took a slow, deep breath. He'd been here before, dealing with people like Walters who thought a black man in a suit was an anomaly, a problem to be solved. "I assure you, officer, I'm simply going about my day," Elijah replied, his tone steady but firm. Walters's smirk faded, replaced by a sneer. "Got an ID on you?" Elijah studied him for a moment before reaching into his pocket, moving slowly. He pulled out his wallet and handed over his ID, his gaze unwavering. Walters examined it with exaggerated care, his lips twisting as he glanced between the ID and Elijah's face. "Elijah Foster. Sounds familiar," he said, though his tone suggested anything but recognition. Elijah crossed his arms, maintaining his composure. "Am I free to go now, officer?" "Not so fast." Walters held up a hand, his eyes gleaming with a strange satisfaction. "See, I have a few more questions." Elijah's patience was beginning to wear thin. "I don't see why that's necessary. I haven't done anything wrong." Walters let out a low chuckle. "That's what they all say," he replied, shaking his head. "Guys like you, strolling around like you own the place. It's not adding up. The watch, the suit, the whole attitude." Elijah's gaze sharpened. "What exactly are you implying?" Walters stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I'm implying that someone like you doesn't get all this," he gestured to Elijah's attire, "without doing something shady, or maybe it's all just stolen. Wouldn't surprise me." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice controlled. "Everything I own, I earned," he said, a note of steel in his tone. "Sure you did," Walters replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "People like you always have an excuse. Always a story. But see, I'm not buying it." Elijah took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "People like me?" Walters shrugged, the smirk returning. "You know exactly what I mean. You're out here, flaunting this lifestyle, acting like you're above everyone else. But I can see right through it." Elijah's patience snapped, and he met Walter's gaze, his own voice hardening. "I don't think you know a thing about me, officer." "Oh, I know enough," Walters shot back, his voice rising slightly. "I know that you're the type who thinks the rules don't apply to you, walking around here like you're untouchable." "Untouchable?" Elijah repeated, his voice steady but his anger clear. "You're the one stopping me for no reason, demanding explanations I don't owe you." Walter's face flushed with anger. "No reason," he scoffed. "I'd say I have plenty of reasons. You look like someone who's hiding something." "Hiding what, exactly?" Elijah challenged, his tone sharp. "Success? Hard work. Maybe that's what you can't handle. Seeing someone who doesn't fit your narrow idea of who should be successful." Walter's expression darkened, and he took another step closer, invading Elijah's space. "Watch your mouth," he warned. "You're walking a fine line here." Elijah held his ground, refusing to look away. "You're the one crossing lines, officer. This entire conversation is inappropriate, and you know it." For a moment, Walters said nothing, just stared at Elijah, his face twisted with frustration and something close to rage. Then, slowly, he smiled, a cold, dangerous smile. "You know what?" he said, his voice low and menacing. "I think you're going to regret this little attitude of yours." Elijah didn't flinch. "I think you're the one who's going to regret this, officer. You have no right to treat people this way." The two men stood there, locked in a silent standoff, the tension thick in the air. Finally, Elijah turned, making it clear he intended to walk away. But as he took a step, Walters reached out, grabbing his shoulder and yanking him back. "Where do you think you're going?" Walters growled, his voice dangerously low. Elijah pulled his arm free, his gaze steady. "I'm leaving, officer." "I suggest you don't make this any worse than it already is." But Walter's face contorted with anger, and before Elijah could react, the officer's fist shot forward, connecting with Elijah's jaw in a brutal, unexpected punch. Elijah stumbled back, catching himself, his expression a mix of shock and fury. Walters advanced, his eyes blazing. "You think you're better than me? You think you can just walk away?" Elijah steadied himself, his voice cold. "You just made a huge mistake, officer." Walters sneered. "You think I'm scared of some guy in a suit? I'm the law here, and I say you're under arrest." Elijah's voice was deadly calm. "You're going to regret this, officer. Mark my words." "Oh, I don't think so," Walters replied, reaching for his taser with a smug grin, "because out here, no one's gonna help you. No one's coming to save you." Elijah opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Walters fired the taser. A jolt of electricity surged through Elijah's body, dropping him to his knees. Walters moved in quickly, slapping handcuffs onto Elijah's wrists with practiced ease. "Look at you now," Walters sneered, standing over him. "Not so high and mighty, are we?" Elijah gritted his teeth, fighting through the pain. "You don't understand what you've just done," he managed to say, his voice a mixture of anger and resolve. "Oh, I understand perfectly," Walters replied, yanking him to his feet. "You're just another punk who thought he was above the law. Well, guess what? You're not." Elijah remained silent, letting Walters drag him toward the squad car. Every step, he reminded himself to stay calm, to keep his focus. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As Walters shoved him into the back seat, Elijah looked up, his gaze steady and unbroken. "You'll regret this," he said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. Walters laughed, slamming the door shut. "I don't think so, Foster. In fact, I think this is just the beginning." The car pulled away, leaving the quiet street behind, but Elijah's mind was already turning, planning. The squad car rolled through the city streets, the lights of nearby buildings flashing past. In the back seat, Elijah Foster sat quietly, his wrists aching from the too tight handcuffs digging into his skin. Officer Walters glanced at him in the rearview mirror, a smug smile twisting his mouth. "What's the matter?" Walters taunted, his tone mocking. "Not used to this kind of ride? Or do you normally get driven around in one of those fancy black cars, huh?" Elijah remained silent, fixing his gaze out the window. "Oh, I get it," Walters continued, feigning sympathy. "Must be tough, right? To think you were on top of the world, probably bossing people around, thinking you were hot stuff. Then you end up here, with a nice pair of cuffs on. Bet you never thought this would happen to someone like you." Elijah took a slow, deep breath, keeping his tone level. "Someone like me? You mean someone minding his own business? Walking down the street?" Walters let out a harsh laugh. "You really don't get it, do you? Walking around with all that flash, Acting like you're some kind of big shot? People like you don't belong in that world. You know it, and I know it. Elijah finally met his gaze in the mirror. People like me? And what exactly does that mean, Officer Walters? Walters smirked, not even bothering to hide his contempt. It means, I don't care how much money you have, or what kind of suit you wear. You think you can buy respect. Walk around here like you're untouchable. But here's the truth. People like you don't get a free pass just because you've got a few dollars in your pocket. Elijah's voice was calm but cold. People like me have the same rights as anyone else, officer. I earned what I have, but that doesn't seem to matter to you. Oh, I'm sure you earned it, all right, Walters sneered, voice dripping with sarcasm. Must be easy. Playing the system, getting handouts, probably some charity helping you along the way. You don't fool me. Elijah clenched his jaw, refusing to take the bait. You think you know me? You know nothing about what it took to get here. Walters laughed, shaking his head. You all say the same thing. Some sob story about hard work and earning respect. Please. I've seen your type 100 times. Flashy suit, fancy watch, talking big. But underneath, same thing every time. Nothing but trouble. Elijah's gaze darkened. You don't know anything about me or my life, officer. I worked for everything I have, but you can't even see past your own prejudice. Prejudice? Walters spat, his face twisting with disdain. I call it experience. I know what to expect when I see people like you strutting around, acting like the rules don't apply to you. You think that suit makes you better than everyone else? I don't think I'm better than anyone else, Elijah replied, his voice hardening. But I do know that you're treating me like a criminal without a single reason. Walters scoffed, glancing at him with pure contempt. I don't need a reason. I see people like you and I know what to expect. Always pushing boundaries, always with some excuse, thinking you're special. But here's the thing. You're not. You're just another. Elijah interrupted, his voice cutting through Walters' tirade like ice. Another what, Officer Walters? Walters fell silent for a moment, the tension thickening in the car. He shifted in his seat, his expression darkening. You know what I mean, he muttered, refusing to meet Elijah's gaze in the mirror. No, why don't you say it? Elijah's tone was quiet but unyielding. You've made it clear what you think of me, so go ahead. Say it. Walters gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. Don't get smart with me, he growled. I don't owe you an explanation. People like you, always running your mouths, thinking you can talk your way out of anything. Not this time. Elijah shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. This isn't about talking my way out of anything, officer. It's about you not being able to handle the fact that a black man might actually have a life you think only belongs to you. Walters laughed, a low, mean sound. A black man with money is still a black man. And out here, I'm the one with the power. Doesn't matter what you own or who you think you are. Right now, you're nothing but a suspect. Elijah met his gaze through the rearview mirror, his eyes steady. You're right, officer. You do have power. Right now. But you're too blinded by your own hate to understand the consequences of what you're doing. Consequences? Walters laughed, a harsh bark. You think you can threaten me? From the back of my squad car? You're the one who should be worried. You're in my world now. Your world, Elijah repeated, his voice calm. A world where you think you can treat people however you want and no one will hold you accountable? Walters shrugged. That's right. Out here, I make the rules. And I don't care who you think you are, money or not. When you're dealing with me, you're just another criminal in a fancy suit. Elijah looked out the window, fighting back his anger, his mind racing with thoughts of what he would do next. He knew Walters thought this was the end of the line, that he could treat him however he wanted without consequence. But Elijah was already planning, already thinking about the steps he would take to make sure Walters and others like him never had the chance to abuse their power again. As the car continued down the empty street, Elijah sat back, his expression unreadable, but his eyes filled with a quiet, determined fury. Walters may have had the power now, But that was about to change. As the squad car pulled up to the police station, Elijah felt the weight of the situation sink deeper. The headlights illuminated the worn concrete of the parking lot, casting sharp shadows across the gravel. The silence in the car had been thick with tension, and as soon as they stopped, Officer Walters threw open his door, stomping around to the back and yanking Elijah out with a rough grip. Elijah stumbled as he found his footing, the cold metal of the cuffs biting into his wrists. Walter's hand dug into his arm, guiding him with unnecessary force toward the building. "Bet this wasn't how you planned to end your day, huh?" Walters muttered, a smug grin twisting his lips as he leaned close to Elijah's ear. "Got you out here looking like a big shot. Not so special now, are you?" Elijah kept his gaze forward, refusing to respond. He knew Walters wanted a reaction, wanted to rile him up, but he wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. They entered the station, and Elijah blinked against the harsh, fluorescent lights. Inside, the air was filled with the scent of stale coffee and the low hum of voices. The sounds of ringing phones and distant conversation momentarily hushed, as Walters led Elijah through the station, drawing curious and wary looks from some of the officers at their desks. Elijah could feel their eyes on him, some openly surprised, others exchanging quick glances, as if unsure of what to make of this scene. Walters smirked, savoring the attention. He guided Elijah to a metal bench near the processing desk, shoving him down with a force that nearly made Elijah lose his balance. Elijah steadied himself, his face impassive as he looked up at Walters, who stood over him with a look of pure satisfaction. "Real high and mighty, aren't you?" Walters sneered, circling Elijah like a predator sizing up his prey. "Bet you thought you'd just stroll through life, untouchable, wearing those nice suits, that fancy watch, acting like you're better than the rest of us. But look at you now, just another perp waiting to be processed. Not so glamorous, is it?" Elijah remained silent, keeping his gaze fixed forward, refusing to engage. His silence seemed to only fuel Walters's frustration, and the officer leaned down, his face close to Elijah's. "What's the matter?" Walters taunted, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Got nothing to say now? Or maybe you're just realizing that all those fancy things don't mean a thing in here. You think that suit's gonna get you any special treatment?" Finally, Elijah looked up, his eyes steady and unyielding. His voice was calm, controlled, but there was an edge of steel in his tone. "Special treatment is the last thing I'm looking for, Officer Walters. All I wanted was to walk down the street without being harassed by someone with a badge." Walters let out a derisive snort, crossing his arms as he looked down at Elijah with a smirk. "Oh, I see how it is. You think you're too good for all this, don't you? Too good to be sitting here in cuffs like any other criminal?" Elijah's gaze didn't waver. "I think I have the right to walk down a street without being treated like a criminal," he replied evenly. "I think you're the one who's forgotten his job." A flicker of anger crossed Walter's face, but he quickly covered it with another sneer. "Forgotten my job? My job is to keep this city safe from people like you." He spat, his voice laced with contempt. "People who think they're above everyone else, walking around like the rules don't apply to them. You show up here, flaunting all this money, acting like you own the place. You think that makes you special?" Elijah raised an eyebrow, his expression unchanging. "No, I think it makes me successful. I think it means I've worked for what I have, and I don't need to explain myself to anyone, especially not to you." Walters's face darkened, his knuckles turning white as he clenched his fists. "You know what I think?" he said, leaning down so that his face was inches from Elijah's. "I think you're just another punk with a little money and a big mouth. And in here, that means nothing. In here, you're just another perp who needs to learn some respect." Elijah met his gaze steadily, a faint, cold smile touching his lips. "Respect?" he repeated softly. "That's an interesting word coming from someone who's abusing his authority." Walter's face flushed with anger, and he straightened up, pacing back and forth in front of Elijah like a caged animal. "You really don't get it, do you?" he hissed, voice rising slightly. "All that money, all that power you think you have, none of it matters here. I make the rules in here, and right now, You're just a nobody in cuffs." Elijah's gaze was unflinching. "That's where you're wrong, Officer Walters. I'm not a nobody, and you're going to regret treating me like one." Walters let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "Regret? You think you can threaten me? From the back of my station?" He gestured around, as if the walls themselves would back him up. "You're in my world now, Mr. Foster, and nobody's coming to help you." Elijah's expression didn't change, but there was a glint of defiance in his eyes. "I don't need anyone to come and save me. I can take care of myself just fine. But let me be clear. You're making a mistake, officer, and I think deep down, you know it." Walters rolled his eyes, scoffing. "Right, the big man with his big talk. You're so used to people bowing and scraping that you forgot what it's like to be on the other side, didn't you? To have to answer to someone else. Well, newsflash, you're not in control here." Elijah's voice was calm, but his words cut through Walter's tirade like a blade. "And that's exactly the problem, officer. You think control means power, and you've mistaken your badge for authority. But power doesn't come from a badge. It comes from respect. And you, officer, have none of it." For a moment, Walters was silent, thrown off balance by Elijah's steady defiance. He opened his mouth to respond, but a clerk at the processing desk cleared his throat. Glancing nervously between the two men, Walters shot him a hard look, silencing him with a glare before turning his attention back to Elijah. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Walters said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you're some kind of hero, standing up to me. But let me tell you something. Heroes don't end up in handcuffs. Heroes don't get dragged in here like common criminals. You're just another loudmouth who thought he could talk his way out of trouble." Elijah leaned forward slightly, his gaze unyielding. "I don't need to talk my way out of anything, officer, but I do believe in holding people accountable. And after tonight, I'm going to make sure you understand exactly what that means." Walter's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered, shrugging with feigned indifference. "Go ahead and try, Mr. Big Shot. But don't be surprised when nobody cares. People like you, you're just another headline, another case to file away. Nobody's going to stand up for you. Nobody's going to remember your name." Elijah's expression didn't change, but his voice was icy. "Oh, they'll remember my name, all right. And when they do, they'll remember yours, too." For a brief moment, Walters seemed rattled, but he quickly covered it with a forced laugh. "Keep dreaming, Foster," he said, turning away dismissively. "Let's get this over with." The clerk finally stepped forward, hesitantly taking down Elijah's information, though he cast uncertain glances at Walters as he did so. Walters lingered nearby, arms crossed, still glaring at Elijah with barely veiled hostility. As Elijah completed the booking process, he knew that this was far from over. The humiliation, the taunts, none of it would go unanswered. Elijah sat back, calm but resolute, as Walters continued to hover, unable to shake the unsettling certainty that this was just the beginning. The holding cell was cold, and the fluorescent lights above cast a harsh, unforgiving glow on the metal walls and concrete floor. Elijah sat on a narrow bench, his hands resting on his knees, his expression calm but his mind racing. The cold of the cell was nothing compared to the cold fury simmering inside him. After what felt like an hour, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Elijah looked up to see Officer Walters approaching the cell, accompanied by another officer. Walters held his usual sneer, his satisfaction clear as he unlocked the cell door. "Your lawyer's here," Walters said, voice dripping with condescension. "But don't get too excited. I don't think even she can save you now." Elijah ignored him, rising to his feet as Walters motioned for him to follow. He was led down the sterile hallway to a small meeting room where a tall woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense expression sat waiting. Rebecca Langston, Elijah's lawyer and longtime friend, met his gaze with a reassuring nod. "Mr. Foster," she greeted, her voice professional but with a steely edge that even Walters couldn't ignore. She turned her gaze to Walters, her expression hardening. "And, Officer Walters," he replied, his smirk fading slightly under her intense stare. Rebecca looked him up and down, her disapproval clear. "Officer Walters, "I'll need to speak with my client privately," she said curtly. Walters folded his arms, glancing between them with a glint of annoyance. "Don't take too long. We've got procedures to follow. And he's not getting any special treatment." Rebecca arched an eyebrow, unimpressed. "I think you've already given him plenty of your treatment, Officer Walters. Now, if you'll excuse us." Walters huffed, but eventually turned on his heel, muttering under his breath as he left the room. The door clicked shut, and Rebecca waited a moment before turning to Elijah, her expression softening slightly. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice quiet. Elijah gave a slight nod. "I'm fine," he replied, though there was a simmering anger in his tone. "But Walters, he didn't even try to hide it, Rebecca. From the moment he saw me, he assumed the worst." Rebecca pursed her lips, her gaze hardening. "I'm not surprised. I've seen his type before, and trust me, he's going to regret every single word he said to you. I already have the preliminary paperwork prepared. As soon as you're out, we're filing complaints against him and his department." Elijah nodded, his face set. "Good. I want him held accountable. This can't just be brushed aside." Rebecca opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder, flipping through the documents inside. "I already spoke with the officers at the desk," she said, keeping her voice low. "They weren't exactly forthcoming, but I gathered enough to know Walters doesn't have much of a case against you, just his word, and a thin excuse for probable cause." Elijah shook his head, a bitter smile crossing his lips. "His probable cause was me walking down the street in a suit. He made it clear he didn't believe a black man could afford what I have." Rebecca sighed, her jaw tightening. "Unfortunately, people like Walters aren't unique, but he made a mistake when he targeted you. I'll make sure he knows exactly who he's dealing with." Just then, the door opened, and Walters stepped back inside, leaning against the frame with a smug grin. "Time's up," he announced, clearly enjoying his role. "Hope you had a nice little chat. Won't make any difference, though." Rebecca closed her folder, meeting Walters' gaze with cold determination. "Officer Walters, I suggest you start preparing a defense, because Mr. Foster won't be leaving this station quietly. You can expect a full investigation into your conduct." Walters' smile faltered, but he quickly masked it with a chuckle. "Oh, I'm shaking," he mocked, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. "You think you're going to take me down? You're in my world, lady. Not the other way around." Rebecca raised an eyebrow, her voice sharp and unyielding. "We'll see whose world this really is when this gets to court. And believe me, it will." Walter's smirk faded entirely, replaced by a look of irritation. He was used to having control, to intimidating anyone he deemed a threat. But Rebecca's unwavering confidence was starting to get under his skin. "You think you're some kind of hotshot, don't you?" he sneered, addressing Elijah. "Think you're gonna waltz out of here and ruin me just because you have a fancy lawyer?" Elijah met his gaze calmly, his voice measured. "I don't need to ruin you, officer. You're doing that all on your own." Walters took a step closer, his face inches from Elijah's. "Keep dreaming, Foster. People like you don't have the power you think you do." Rebecca cut in, her tone icy. "I'd watch your words carefully, officer. Every threat you make is another nail in the coffin of your career." Walters shot her a glare before backing off, his confidence shaken but his anger still evident. "Fine. Have it your way," he muttered. "But don't think this is over. Not by a long shot." He turned and stormed out, leaving Rebecca and Elijah alone in the room once more. Rebecca took a steadying breath, then looked back at Elijah with a determined glint in her eye. "We're going to make this right," she said quietly. "People like him shouldn't be allowed to abuse their power, and with the connections you have, we'll make sure he doesn't get away with it." Elijah nodded, a fierce resolve hardening within him. "Let's get started. I want every complaint filed, every record scrutinized. Walters thinks he's untouchable, but he's about to learn how wrong he is." Rebecca smiled, her confidence matching his. "Then let's make sure he never forgets it." As they left the room, Elijah felt the weight of what was to come settle on his shoulders. This was no longer just about him. It was about holding people like Walters accountable, about changing a system that allowed unchecked power to run rampant. And he was ready to fight, no matter what it took. The morning after his release, Elijah returned to the police department with Rebecca. Not to settle, but to challenge. They strode into the station, a quiet determination in their steps, Elijah's presence exuding an undeniable authority that turned heads and made people look twice. Rebecca's face was set with the resolve of someone who wouldn't leave without answers. They had barely crossed the lobby when a voice called out, "Mr. Foster, Ms. Langston." Chief Randall Graves appeared from down the hallway, his face composed, but carrying a trace of unease. He approached with a handshake that both Elijah and Rebecca ignored. "Chief Graves," Rebecca began, her voice sharp, "we're here to discuss Officer Walters' blatant misconduct. His unprovoked harassment and abuse of Mr. Foster last night were not only unprofessional but outright criminal. I'm sure you understand the gravity of this situation." Graves sighed, gesturing toward a conference room. "Please, let's discuss this privately." He led them into the room and closed the door, eyeing both Elijah and Rebecca with a forced calm. "Mr. Foster," he began, "I understand that last night was difficult. I assure you, Officer Walters' actions are not reflective of our department's values. We'll be reviewing his conduct." "Reviewing?" Rebecca interrupted, her tone icy. "Chief Graves, reviewing is a long way from accountability. Mr. Foster was publicly humiliated and violently detained because Officer Walters couldn't see past his own racist assumptions. Reviewing won't suffice." The chief hesitated, trying to keep control of the conversation. "We take these accusations seriously, but I hope you understand that our officers work under intense pressure." "Pressure?" Elijah finally spoke, his voice cutting through Graves's excuses. "Walking down the street in a suit isn't pressure. Walters made it clear what he thought of people like me. He couldn't believe that a black man could have anything of worth without being a criminal. And last night, he thought he could get away with treating me like one." Chief Graves looked away, clearing his throat. "I understand, Mr. Foster." "But you don't understand," Rebecca snapped. "Officer Walters went beyond simple profiling. He was openly racist, from his taunts to his threats. He spoke to Mr. Foster as if he were beneath him. He harassed him, assaulted him, and dragged him to this very station. And now you're here, offering excuses." A voice interrupted from the door. Walters himself, wearing an expression of smug defiance, entered the room. "Chief, I wasn't aware you'd invited our special guests back," he sneered, casting a disdainful glance at Elijah and Rebecca. "I thought we'd already handled this situation last night." Chief Graves shot him a look, but didn't ask him to leave. Walters, emboldened by his presence, continued. "So, you brought a fancy lawyer," Walters said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Guess you figured it'd be easier than just admitting what you are. A guy who doesn't belong here, pretending he does." Elijah met his gaze, unblinking. "And what exactly do you think I am, Officer Walters?" Walters scoffed. "Someone who got a little too big for his boots, thinking a suit makes him respectable. You think a watch and a car can cover up where you came from?" Rebecca leaned forward, her voice like ice. "You're playing with fire, Officer Walters." But Walters wasn't listening. He was enjoying himself too much, eyes fixed on Elijah with thinly veiled hatred. "People like you, they all think they're special. You might fool people on the outside, but in here, you're just another lowlife who got lucky. And I'm not about to be lectured by someone who thinks a little money can change who they really are." Elijah held up a hand, stopping Rebecca from responding. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "You're right, Officer Walters. A little money doesn't change who you are. That's why I didn't stop at a little money." Walters narrowed his eyes, confused. Elijah continued, his tone sharp and controlled. "I'm Elijah Foster. And I'm not just some lucky lowlife. I'm one of the largest private investors in this city. I'm a billionaire officer. I own companies that employ thousands of people. I could buy and sell this department 100 times over." The room went dead silent. Walter's smug expression slipped, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. Chief Graves's eyes widened, a nervous sweat breaking out on his brow. He looked from Elijah to Walters, clearly grasping the gravity of the situation for the first time. What did you say?" Walters stammered, his bravado crumbling. Elijah didn't flinch. "I said I'm a billionaire, Officer Walters. And I'm not here for your respect. I'm here to make sure you answer for every single thing you did last night." Chief Graves looked visibly shaken, clearing his throat as he tried to regain control. "Mr. Foster, I assure you, we'll launch a full investigation. We'll cooperate with you in every way possible." Elijah's gaze turned icy. "An investigation? That's not enough. This isn't just about me. It's about every single person who's ever been humiliated by someone like him. I'm going to ensure reforms happen in this department, Chief. And if I have to pour my resources into it, I'll make sure it's thorough." Walters paled, shifting uncomfortably, his former arrogance replaced by growing dread. "Look, I didn't realize," Rebecca scoffed, her tone cutting. "Didn't realize? You didn't care. You assumed he was beneath you, and you acted on that without a second thought." Walters was silent, his face white as he stammered, "Mr. Foster, I apologize. I didn't know." Elijah's tone was cold, unrelenting. "No, you didn't know, because you didn't even try to see who I was. To you, I was just another black man to be put in his place. Well, I assure you, Officer Walters, you're the one who's about to learn his place." Chief Graves cleared his throat, his face pale. "Mr. Foster, Officer Walters will be placed on immediate suspension. I will personally oversee the investigation and ensure everything is done according to protocol." Elijah's gaze didn't soften. "It's a start. But know this, Chief Graves, I'm not walking away from this until there's accountability, not just for Walters, but for everyone who stood by and allowed this culture to thrive. I have the means, and I have the will." Chief Graves nodded hastily, sweat visibly forming on his brow. "Of course, Mr. Foster. We'll do everything in our power to cooperate." Elijah rose, smoothing his suit with a calm, deliberate motion. "Then I trust I'll see results, and soon, because if I don't, I'll bring this to the public, to the media, to the courts, and I assure you, I have the resources to keep it there until justice is served." Walter's face was now ashen, his mouth slightly open as he realized the true extent of his mistake. He seemed to shrink in his chair, eyes fixed downward, the full weight of his actions settling heavily on him. As Elijah and Rebecca turned to leave, Elijah paused by the door, casting one last unflinching look at Walters. "Remember this moment, officer, because by the time I'm through, it won't just be me you answer to. It'll be the entire city." With that, Elijah walked out, leaving behind a silence so thick that not even Chief Graves could muster a response. Elijah sat alone in his office, the city lights casting a soft glow through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His desk was neat and orderly, though it was clear his mind was anything but. The meeting with Walters and Chief Graves had concluded hours ago, but the impact of their words lingered, echoing in the stillness around him. A soft knock sounded at the door. Rebecca stepped in, her expression thoughtful as she studied him. She crossed the room, taking a seat across from his desk without waiting for an invitation. "You've been quiet since we left the station." Elijah looked at her, his eyes distant. "It's a lot to process," he admitted. "There are so many directions this could go, so many ways I could use this power." Rebecca leaned forward slightly, her gaze intent. "And you have every right to use it, Elijah. What Walters did wasn't just personal. It was systemic, a symptom of a problem that's deeper than just one man. You know this." Elijah nodded, his jaw tight. "That's exactly what I keep thinking about. I could use my resources, my connections, to ruin Walters. I could expose him, push for his dismissal, ensure he never works in law enforcement again. I could turn the entire department upside down if I wanted to. And believe me, there's a part of me that wants to." Rebecca studied him, sensing the conflict in his voice. "But?" Elijah took a deep breath, glancing out the window at the skyline. "But that's only one way to use this power. I could make Walters pay for every second of that humiliation. But would that really change anything? Would it help anyone else?" He paused, his expression reflective. "Or would it just be personal vengeance disguised as justice?" Rebecca considered his words, nodding slowly. "So you're saying you want to go further than just Walters?" Elijah turned back to her, a newfound resolve settling over him. "This isn't about just one man, Rebecca. What I went through last night, how many others have been through the same thing? How many people don't have the resources to fight back? People who are wrongfully detained, mistreated, humiliated, all because someone in power decides they're suspicious. I could destroy Walters, but if I do that without changing the system, someone else just like him will take his place. Rebecca's gaze softened. You want to reform the system itself? Elijah nodded, a hint of conviction brightening his voice. I do. Walters is one piece of a much larger puzzle. I want to use this situation as leverage to bring about real change, bias training, oversight committees, accountability measures, not just in this department, but as a model that can be applied in other cities. We need a way to make sure no one is above the law, especially those who enforce it. Rebecca watched him, admiration clear in her expression. That's ambitious, Elijah. And powerful. But it's also a long, complicated road. I know, he replied, his voice steady, and it won't be easy. But if I have the power to destroy one man, I also have the power to build something better. Something that could protect people who don't have the influence I do. Rebecca's expression softened, and she leaned back, crossing her arms as she studied him. So, what's the plan? Elijah took a deep breath, thinking through the possibilities. First, we work with community leaders to draft a proposal for reforms. We gather data. We interview people who've been through this. We show the patterns of bias and abuse. And we push for specific changes that can hold officers accountable. I have the resources to support this, and I'm willing to make it my focus for as long as it takes. Rebecca nodded, her voice thoughtful. And Walters? A flicker of a smile crossed Elijah's lips. Walters will face consequences. His actions can serve as the catalyst for all of this. He'll be a reminder of what happens when people in power abuse their authority. I'll make sure he's part of this change, whether he wants it or not. Rebecca smiled, her admiration clear. You're taking a stand for something much bigger than yourself, Elijah. That's not easy. Elijah nodded, his voice filled with quiet conviction. It isn't easy, but it's necessary. I'm not just doing this for myself. I'm doing it for every person who's been silenced, who's been told their rights don't matter. And if that means taking on a system, then so be it. As he spoke, the weight on his shoulders seemed to lift, replaced by a new sense of purpose. The decision he'd made wasn't an easy one, but it was one he felt he could stand by. He would use his power not just to settle a score, but to pave a path toward real, lasting change. Rebecca rose, placing a hand on his shoulder. Then, let's get to work. This could be the beginning of something incredible. Elijah nodded, looking out over the city with a steady gaze. Yes, it could, and I'm going to see it through, no matter what it takes. In that quiet moment, with the city lights shining below, Elijah felt a powerful resolve settle within him. He had a chance to make a difference, a real difference, and he wasn't going to waste it. Elijah stood in the hallway of the police department, his hands in his pockets as he waited. The previous week's events had led to this moment, and now, as he glanced around the station, he felt a sense of finality settle over him. Officer Craig Walters was being terminated, and Elijah had come to witness it. Rebecca stood beside him, her expression cool and collected. She had been instrumental in every step, from filing the complaints to drafting the reforms. Together, they had done what most wouldn't even dare to attempt, and now they were here to see it through. The door to Chief Graves's office opened, and the chief himself stepped out, gesturing for Elijah and Rebecca to follow him inside. Inside the room, Walters sat at a long table, his face pale, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. He glanced up as they entered, a flicker of resentment flashing across his face. Chief Graves cleared his throat, keeping his tone formal. Officer Walters, as of today, your position with the department is officially terminated. The review board has cited numerous breaches in protocol, as well as evidence of misconduct and racial bias in your actions last week. Walters clenched his jaw, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. He looked up only briefly, his face twisted with bitterness as he glanced at Elijah. So that's it? I'm out because of him? Chief Graves shifted uncomfortably, but his voice remained firm. You're out because of your actions, Officer Walters. Mr. Foster's complaint merely brought them to light. Elijah watched as Walters absorbed the words, a mixture of anger and frustration brewing in his expression. Finally, Walters looked at Elijah, his gaze cold. "Congratulations, Mr. Foster," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You got what you wanted. Took down the racist cop, huh? Bet that feels good, doesn't it?" Elijah met his gaze steadily, his voice calm. "This was never about taking you down, Walters. This was about holding you accountable, something you never thought would happen." Walters laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Accountable? Please, you're just a rich man using his money to get what he wants. Don't act like you're some hero." Elijah's expression didn't change. "I'm not a hero, Walters, but I'm also not someone who's going to stand by and let people like you treat others with disrespect and contempt. You thought you could do whatever you wanted, that no one would ever challenge you. Well, now you see the consequences." Walters leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he sneered. "Consequences. Easy for you to say, sitting in your penthouse, counting your millions. People like you always talk about accountability until it's your own mess on the line." Elijah's eyes hardened, his voice dropping to a measured tone. "You assume that because I have money, I don't understand struggle. But let me tell you something, Walters. I came from nothing. I fought my way up, and I've faced people like you at every stage. People who judged me without knowing a single thing about me. People who thought they could control me. But I didn't let them, and I'm certainly not letting you." Walter's face flushed with anger. "I was doing my job. Keeping people like you in check is exactly what this city needs." Elijah's mouth set into a hard line. "People like me?" he repeated. "You mean people who don't fit into your narrow, bigoted view of the world? People you think don't deserve the same respect as others?" Walters clenched his fists, his face twisted with resentment. "You may have won this one, but don't think for a second that changes anything. People like me, we're everywhere. You can't change that." Elijah stepped closer, his voice low and unyielding. "Maybe I can't change everyone, but I can change the system that protects people like you, and I can make sure that no one else suffers at your hands." Walter's sneer faltered, his eyes betraying a flicker of fear as he realized the full extent of Elijah's resolve. "You think you're some kind of savior? This city will eat you alive." Elijah held his gaze, his voice steady and calm. "I'm not here to save you, Walters. I'm here to make sure that people like you face the consequences of your actions, and you can fight it. You can sneer and mock, but the world is changing. People are watching, and people like you aren't going to get away with this anymore." There was a heavy silence in the room, the weight of Elijah's words hanging in the air. Walters looked away, his bravado finally slipping, his shoulders sagging as he absorbed the reality of his situation. Chief Graves cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Officer Walters, you have until the end of the day to clear out your belongings. Security will escort you from the premises." Walters stood, shooting one last venomous look at Elijah. "You'll regret this, Foster. You think you're above it all, but one day you'll be in my position, and we'll see how accountable you feel then." Elijah didn't flinch. "The difference is, Walters, I live by my values, and one of them is respect, something you'll never understand." With a final scowl, Walters turned and stormed out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall. The door closed behind him, and silence filled the space once more. Rebecca looked at Elijah, her voice soft. "He's gone." Elijah nodded, a sense of closure settling over him. "Yes, and now the real work begins." Chief Graves exhaled, visibly relieved. "Mr. Foster, I want to thank you for the reforms you've helped us put into place. We'll do our best to uphold them." Elijah's gaze turned serious. "See that you do, Chief, because if I see any signs of backpedaling, I'll be back, and I won't be as forgiving." Chief Graves nodded, his face tense with understanding. "Understood." As Elijah and Rebecca left the station, Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. The system that had allowed Walters to flourish wouldn't be changed overnight, but he had taken the first step, and he would continue to take steps, as many as it took to create a world where no one had to endure what he had. Walking out into the afternoon sunlight, Elijah took a deep breath, feeling a sense of liberation and resolve. He had faced down the system, he had seen it bend, And he wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning of the change he was determined to make.